Well, for all those who weren't dragged away by the shiny lights of the metaverse, well done, because, of course, far more enduring than all this kind of hype around the metaverse is the fundamental issue of human rights. And that's what this session is really going to focus on in terms of the tech industry's role in respecting and supporting human rights. And I should first of all start off thanking colleagues from BT for who've helped to sponsor this session, and thank you very much for doing that. So we've got a very interesting discussion ahead with a fantastic team of people who've got tremendous kind of background in these areas. We've got Dr. Anjali Mazumba, who is AI Justice and Human Rights Theme Lead at the Alan Turing Institute. We've got Colin Curry, who is Technology Policy Principal at Ofcom. We've got Tetana Tsegea, who is Strategy and Governance Manager responsible for tech and human rights at BT. And I'm very glad that behind me we have Jan Kleijsen, who's Director of Council of Europe. Jan, can you hear us okay? Great to see you. Thank you for joining us. So what is this relationship, and what is the relationship between the broader discussion that we've had today around digital ethics and the actual kind of fundamental issue of human rights? Because surely, in many ways, what we're trying to, the whole purpose of these digital ethics that we talk about should be around kind of underpinning these kind of fundamental human rights that have been, developed over time and are now kind of deeply embedded into the way that we think about kind of global governance. So that's kind of really the theme of today's discussion. But I wanted to just allow the panelists a few minutes just to give us their introduction, and then we will get into a bit of a discussion. And to everybody in the audience and also online, if you do have questions, please do just throw up your hands, and because I'd like to make this session as interactive as we can. So at any stage through the conversation today, please do raise your hand. Can we start, Anjali, with you? Can we give us your starting point for today's discussion, please?
Sure. As mentioned, I'm at the Alan Turing Institute, which, for those of you who don't know, that's the UK's National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. And so a lot of our work is, again, fundamental research in data science and AI. And ideally, what we want to do, of course, is how data science and AI can make a difference, make the world a better place. What role does it play in achieving some of the big grand challenges, whether that's environment and sustainability or health, or any of the other ones that we are facing today. So in my role as the human rights lead, and really what my team and I have been focused on is looking at sort of the interconnectedness of the issues around human rights, inclusion and accountability, and seeing that as intrinsically linked in our mission, which is really around how do we develop and deploy AI and AI-related technologies in a way that respects human rights and allows for everyone to benefit from scientific progress and also to participate in scientific progress. So within that, I think that unpacks a lot of challenges, but also opportunities for us to really do better than we have been. I think earlier we were sort of talking that sometimes what we have is we're, in each of our roles, we're sitting in academia, in industry, in as policymakers in the public sector or the nonprofit sort of civil society areas. And we can sometimes be siloed, all making great efforts towards some aspect of this endeavor. So my work and approach has really been trying to see how we can do better. And much of that is intertwined with how do we kind of, from the beginning of what we often refer to as the AI lifecycle, is how do we work together in doing that. So it really is both from an academic standpoint of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary work, but also cross-sector collaboration, and often even thinking about that from a global perspective. Because when we're working on grand challenges, and we're also thinking about data or any of these areas, they're not siloed to one area. One of the overlapping areas it seems that we've or have been involved in some way is around modern slavery and sort of a labor justice issue, which that again transcends not just from a global perspective, but also it's not just often labor, it's often criminal justice, it's migration, it's all these areas that's also impacted by climate change and conflict that is perpetuating this. So it's recognizing that these are really complex societal challenges. And so when you try to develop a technology, an intervention that is ideally trying to do this for good, to try and support whether it's policymakers or industry or civil society, we need to bring that interconnectedness together. And that the data in itself is not just data, it's not just sitting somewhere siloed, it is about people, and it's about systems and infrastructure and bringing that interconnectedness together. So I think bringing this back to some of the challenges that we potentially also have is that it is actually interfering or frustrating sort of the traditional mechanisms for accountability in this space. And that's where it's why we're sort of looking at what is the intersection between human rights, inclusion, and accountability as we design and develop technology. So our role is really bring that together. We want to actually develop technologies, recognizing should we be developing some of these in the spaces that they're at? And if we do, then how do we develop oversight and the mechanisms in there? And recognizing that all the actors in the space also have different incentives and priorities within that, which can sometimes I don't know if conflict is the right word, but they certainly create imbalances in itself. So maybe I'll leave that there. We can get into that.
Tana, tell us how this appears from kind of BT's perspective and your role in terms of BT as a company.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I work with BT to advise the business on human rights risks across our value chain. So this means that I work to embed our responsible tech principles and human rights principles into how we buy, use, develop, and sell technology. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with BT being a household name here in the UK, so you'll be familiar with our consumer side of the business. We also sell into 180 countries around the world, so have a global business. And in that global business outside the UK, we tend to sell to multinational organizations, international organizations, governments, both local and national, and that kind of is relevant to some points that I'll be making later. And I'd like just to take this opportunity to share with you some of the questions we've been asking ourselves and thinking carefully about over this past year across three kind of distinct areas of our value chain. So starting with how we develop products and innovate, we've been asking ourselves, how can we really embed human rights principles into the way we think about, kind of conceive products from the very beginning, at that ideation stage, and then embed those principles through design, through development, through sale and marketing of those products. And part of this requires us to think about people and take kind of a people-focused approach to understand what impacts might occur depending on people's particular characteristics. So for example, as a brand that serves families, we recently undertook a digital child rights impact assessment, which helped us to understand what our impacts are on children, but also the opportunities that we have to support the realization of children's rights. Another example of kind of how we're thinking about this across a product lifecycle is thinking about how certain technologies might facilitate coercive and controlling behaviors, and thinking through what we might do at the design stage to mitigate those risks. Moving on to kind of our second bucket of work, thinking about how we use and buy technology, we are thinking very carefully about how we carry across our human rights principles into the partnerships that we enter into and into the technology that we buy into the business. So thinking carefully about if we're using or buying in AI technology off the shelf, Do we really know kind of what is behind that technology? What kind of questions do we in the business need to be thinking about in order to make those decisions in a human rights respecting way? And the final part of our value chain I'll touch on quickly, and kind of the big questions we're thinking about around sales really relate to how we assess risks of sales. So this goes to kind of that global component that I started with earlier. So we undertake human rights impact assessments to understand risks related to countries that we're selling into, products we're selling, and the customers we're selling to. And the big question we're grappling with is, as social and political contexts change, sometimes gradually, sometimes rapidly, how do we detect those changes and make sure that we are responding to those changes, and how we're assessing risk in current opportunities and future opportunities that we might go after. So when I say we embed across the value chain, that's just kind of a flavor of the work that we're thinking about this year. And I am looking forward to the Q&A, because I think that we'll be getting into some of the depths of some of these pieces.
Thank you. I mean, I've got lots of questions myself around some of those kind of issues around value chains, but also this very, very interesting points about kind of the fast nature of events and how events can suddenly throw up human rights concerns for a business that you might not have anticipated days or weeks in advance. I think it's a very interesting thing to come back to. I want to bring in Jan from the Council of Europe next. Obviously, the Council of Europe has human rights at the core of its mission. I'm very interested, Jan, in your perspective on the tech industry's role in relation to human rights.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone from chilly Strasbourg. I would have loved to have been with you, but I'm very happy to technology making it possible for me to address you. And thank you very much for the opportunity. I only regret that the session, the metaverse, is taking place at the same time, because I had a number of things. I still have a number of things to say about the metaverse and human rights. So perhaps you can kindly pass those messages on later to the participants that are now having an interesting debate in an adjacent room. Perhaps a few words about the Council of Europe, and not quite a household name in the UK like BT. So perhaps explain in 2 words that Council of Europe is not the European Union, and I'm not based in Brussels. We're an organization of 46 states, until very recently 47. But following Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the Council of Europe, and as you said, its core mission is human rights, rule of law, decided to expel the Russian Federation within 3 weeks from the invasion of Ukraine. So we're now 46. We try to promote human rights and rule of law, democracy, our holy trinity, if you like, through law and through binding law, not just policy statements, although we also have those, but we also have some 200 conventions. One of them is perhaps a household name in the UK, the European Convention on Human Rights, which is, and the court here in Strasbourg, which are part of the Council of Europe. But in addition to that, we have some 200 other conventions, and then a number of them deal with technology. The Council of Europe was the first organization to realize that data protection and human rights were in need of more stringent regulation. And that's why 40 years ago, the Council of Europe adopted the Convention on Data Protection. And that came at a time when virtually no country in the world had any data protection legislation to speak of. It inspired the GDPR. We often refer to it as the mother or even the grandmother of the GDPR. And it's now applied in 55 countries worldwide, and some 70 countries participate in the work on data protection. I'm saying this because when we speak afterwards about today's challenges, I would like to stress that although the Council of Europe has only 46, or only, but it has 46 states, member states, some of its standards have become truly global standards. The second example is and that is a treaty you may be familiar with, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which now since last week brings together 68 countries. Brazil formally acceded a week ago, so that brings an extra 200 million people under the cover of this treaty. And last year we were active in 135 countries worldwide. to build capacity against cybercrime. Now it has become apparent, and I will answer your question in a few seconds, that artificial intelligence, amongst other technologies, is increasingly being used by public authorities, delegating tasks that are traditionally carried out by human agents of government to artificial, to machine learning and machine-made decisions. In my own country, sadly, and I just tweeted about that with your Twitter handle on it. A recent case in the Netherlands. It started 3 or 4 years ago when tax authorities decided to fight fraud with regard to child benefits and deployed an AI system to help them do so. This led to absolutely catastrophic consequences because of the lack of governance of this process, the wrong data sets, the lack of human oversight, an insufficiently prepared judiciary and non-trained judiciary. Some 40,000 people were wrongly accused of having defrauded the system. In other words, they were considered criminals, forced to pay back huge sums of money because it was assumed that everything they had received was also the result of abuse of this child benefit system. Number of people committed suicide. There were deaths. Over 2,000 children were removed from their families and still haven't been returned. The government had to resign. The president of the highest administrative tribunal apologized on television for miscarriage of justice, and the tragedy is still ongoing. In an opinion on this tragedy that was issued by the Council of Europe's expert body on constitutional law, the Venice Commission, it was pointed out that what happened in the Netherlands, and that's why I'm mentioning it, not because I'm Dutch, but because what happened in the Netherlands could easily happen elsewhere and may even be happening as we speak. So it was pointed out that it's urgent to move to proper governance of artificial intelligence, especially when it's used by public authorities. That is what the Council of Europe is doing at the moment. It is working on what we hope will be the world's first global treaty on artificial intelligence human rights, like our Data Protection Treaty and like our Cybercrime Convention, where we have demonstrated that we can cater for well beyond Europe and set global standards. I should add, for instance, on cybercrime, that the United States is also a party to this treaty. We are negotiating, and now I come also to your question, the role of the tech industry. We are negotiating this future global treaty with 52 states, our 46 plus the 5 observers we have, which are the United States, Canada, Mexico, Japan, the Holy See. The government of Israel made a specific ad hoc request, although it's not a member, it's not an observer, but to join these negotiations. At the recent IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, that I think a number of you will be very familiar with, which took place in Ethiopia a week ago, a number of countries expressed great interest also being admitted to these negotiations. And we have NGOs, and last but not least, we have you. We have the business community. We have digital partners, amongst the BT and other. We all have a number of other telecoms. We have the big American companies. We also have associations of SMEs in this field that have a seat at the table because they have applied for what we term the jargon, the digital partnership with the Council of Europe, under which the private sector, either associations or big companies, can apply if they are willing to subscribe to our values, i.e. human rights, rule of law and democracy. They can be granted this digital partnership status, which gives them a seat at the table. So now we have at the moment 25 companies and associations of companies, internet service providers, but also telecoms I mentioned, standard setters like IEEE. We were recently joined by the International Chamber of Commerce. So we have a variety of private sector actors working with us. It's going to go very fast. I'll end here. The mandate to deliver this treaty is November next year. So we have basically a year to negotiate. We have done preparatory work for 2 years, so we're confident that it can be done. It is very complementary to what the European Union is doing with its AI Act. But that, I would like to point out, of course, is an act limited to internal EU regulation for 27 states. Our aim is to provide a global framework of binding standards to help prevent what happened in my country and which may quite possibly be happening as we speak elsewhere. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. I really, really fascinating in terms of the way in which you describe the way, in many ways, the development of human rights and the human rights framework actually really underpins everything that we've been talking about today in relation to digital ethics. But also, I mean, we had a very interesting session earlier today, talking about how we learn from mistakes, and I think the benefit fraud case in the Netherlands is almost a perfect example of something that we can't afford, to fail to learn the mistakes from. And I think, and the other big theme that we've been talking about today, is this one around kind of the need for international collaboration, and again, the work that you're driving there, I think, is phenomenally important. Colin, I'd like to turn to you now. I mean, I talked earlier today when I was talking about Ofcom about, it's a traditional kind of economic regulator, and I asked sort of a question about whether, how an economic regulator sort of deals with these questions around these less tangible questions sometimes around ethics. But of course, human rights is quite tangible, isn't it? It's something that's quite real and quite specific. But tell us more about how Ofcom sort of places these issues in its wider remit.
Sure, happy to. Human rights is a really difficult thing. It's tangible insofar as the impacts can be really severely felt and experienced by people, but then it's also intangible in that it's often quite difficult to quantify, measure, or assess the different trade-offs, whether it's for a policymaker, a business, or someone from civil society or academia. So just by way of background, I oversee a new tech policy team, and one of our missions is to connect the internal technical expertise that we have within Ofcom and have been cultivating over the past year with our policy-making functions. So right now, a lot of Ofcom is geared towards getting us prepared to take on our new duties under the Online Safety Bill, which I'm sure that everyone has heard about. And that's throwing up some really interesting human rights considerations. The first time that I read the Online Safety Bill, coming from a human rights background, I actually saw a lot of parallels in the main provisions. So, for example, the requirements for companies to carry out a risk assessment or have aspects of transparency reporting. I saw a lot of parallels to human rights due diligence under the United Nations Guiding Principles, whether it's around carrying out impact assessments or knowing and showing and reporting back to impacted rights holders. So I think there's a lot of synergy there in the baseline thinking. However, if you follow the news, you've seen that a lot of these values or priorities can also be put in tension, especially in how it's reported. So here I'm thinking, for example, around policy priorities to safeguard and protect children, or to prosecute certain new offenses that have been introduced on the face of the bill, versus the potential impact on fundamental rights and freedoms, namely privacy and freedom of expression. So this actually isn't totally new for Ofcom because we have a history of balancing these qualified rights, specifically freedom of expression or rights like the linguistic rights of linguistically diverse communities. So, for example, Welsh speakers in Wales, and trying to figure out how best to protect these while maintaining news plurality and fostering public debate in the interest of having a healthy democracy. We do this as we regulate broadcast and handle complaints on programming. We're often known as the Love Island regulator. That's an area where we get a lot of complaints and have to weigh those very carefully against these broader considerations. We don't act on the vast majority of consumer complaints that we receive because they don't meet that very high threshold of intervention as a regulator. So I think that the way that this translates into the relationship between human rights and the tech industry is I don't have to reinforce that technology now underpins so many aspects of our life that the potential human rights impacts go well beyond privacy and freedom of expression. They can touch on any number of civil and political rights, freedom of association, equality, non-discrimination, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, whether it's the right to work, the right to education, or the rights of ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities that I referred to before. So I think that the challenge here is that it's such a complex ecosystem where any one company acting in isolation or any one regulator making regulation, it's difficult to have the full scope of the picture, and the kind of sometimes the tangible benefits that you might see and be able to write a news story, a compelling news story about, might be more visible or more present in the debate than the intangible impacts, which could ultimately have a significant, could be consequential for democracies or for individuals. So I think one of the things that's really important, I mean, as Ofcom, we are required to consider fundamental rights and freedoms as a public authority under the Human Rights Act. So there is an element of obligation, but I think that's also a choice that we also care very, very deeply about our work and do quite a lot of thinking to try to assess what the impacts of intervention as well as non-intervention would be from a regulatory perspective. Because sometimes designing regulation can have consequences or can have impacts in and of itself. So I think it's complicated. It's not up to just companies alone. There is a role for regulators and for policymakers to play in considering the impact or the intersections between technology and human rights. And obviously, we benefit from the collective intelligence of drawing on academia, drawing on civil society. Essentially, no stakeholder actor acting in isolation will be able to make progress on this or to anticipate all of the possible unintended consequences. So I think our perspective is it's really important to take your time to be evidence-based and to engage with as many perspectives and stakeholders as possible in making these types of decisions.
I want to explore in a little bit more detail a bit later on this question of kind of balancing qualified rights, because you talked about Ofcom's expertise and experience in doing that. But of course, when you think about things like the online safety bill and so on, actually we're actually asking lots of private companies to go through the same process, aren't we, of balancing these qualified rights? And I think in many ways, much of the discussion that we have today around the governance of technology comes down to questions around this balance of these qualified rights. I want to come back to that, but before we go there, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the human rights issues that are coming to the fore, and Tetana, in particular from a BT perspective, what are the biggest issues that keep kind of coming up on your radar, and what are the things that as a business you're having to think about, and are there kind of new issues that are emerging that you didn't previously have to think about but you do now?
Thanks for the question, the big question. So I highlighted a few of the big questions we're thinking about. I think the ones to really zero in on relate to emerging technologies, relate to downstream impacts of technology and your products that you sell, and then also stakeholder engagement in this industry and what makes it different to stakeholder engagement in other industries. So the first, we know that the tech industry has traditionally been really innovative, moved fast, pushed boundaries, but we also know that this has come with pretty sizable risks and harms. So the big question here is thinking about how do you support innovation? How do you support the development of technology to improve lives? This is the big question I think of this whole day. But also put in place the guardrails, the guidance needed to ensure that it doesn't, what we are developing doesn't do harm. So that's the first kind of bucket on emerging technologies. The second, thinking about downstream impacts, and also thinking about end use, how your products are used. It's sometimes a complicated exercise to anticipate what risks might arise when you are far removed from those potential risks. So for example, if you're supplying internet infrastructure, there are different harms that might arise as a result, but that you couldn't possibly anticipate because they're so far removed. I think a second complicating factor around downstream impacts and end use might relate to how you sell products. So if you're using resellers, for example, where there are different companies that might resell your products, you might not know who your end user is and how they might use your product. So it might be difficult to anticipate misuse by those end users. So I think this is a big question for the tech industry to think about, and it's a real responsibility that we know that we have under the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights, and have a responsibility to get right. And then just finally, on stakeholder engagement, when impacts are not immediate or further kind of downstream, one question that I've been asking myself is, what does regular and meaningful stakeholder engagement look like? I previously worked in business and human rights in other sectors, so working in the mining sector, for example, or large-scale agriculture, where it can be quite easy to understand who might be impacted by your operations. It could be quite a closed group of people, so you know what meaningful stakeholder engagement could look like in that context. In the context of the tech industry, your products might be so far dispersed, you then need to think about proxies and how you engage different organizations who might be able to represent the views of certain groups. So we really need to think about how to make sure that we're speaking to the right people, that we are identifying who might be most vulnerable, and also just thinking about the interaction and what others get from the interaction and the engagement with you to make sure that it's not an extractive process, and that we avoid putting stakeholders we do engage into kind of a state of engagement fatigue because we keep going back again and again to speak with them. So those are kind of three big issues that we've been thinking about.
You mentioned kind of mining there. I think how does a company like BT kind of think about the sort of the physical impacts in terms of the minerals and the metals and the plastics that are required to build the products that provide the infrastructure and the connectivity? Is that all seen through a human rights kind of framework, or is that sort of part of the day job, as it were?
Yeah, definitely. So it fits into kind of the buy and use part of our value chain, and thinking about kind of the traditional human rights kind of bread and butter work about suppliers and supplier due diligence. So it really does fit in, and it also cuts across kind of broader sustainability work to think about how your products not only where the materials come from, but what happens to the materials at the end, and thinking about circularity.
Yeah, and Jan, if I could come back to you, in terms of the work that you're doing, in terms of really trying to push forward with those 52 states, are there kind of specific issues that are really kind of front of mind for you as an organisation, or is it really the sort of coherence of the overall framework that is what you're trying to achieve?
I think there are several issues that come to mind and that have already been mentioned, in fact, by my co-panelists. It is the systems itself, and there, of course, the tech industry has an important role to ensure that when you design something, and I was very encouraged by what I heard, when you design something, that human rights should be an afterthought, that your service, post-sales service department comes up with, and say, oh, by the way, it seems that we've had a human rights problem with one of our products, but perhaps have your engineers, and I'm sure this is happening, that your engineers at an early stage are sitting together with the people who are able to give an informed opinion on what possible effects could be. I think we should also be modest in the sense that even with the best precautions, we will not be able to avoid all harm being done. And I think it's therefore very important that we have remedies. Our treaty, and when I say treaty, I think that also it's important perhaps to underline, this is not going to be something abstract that will float in the air. The idea of a treaty is that it's translated into national law. So the aim of this treaty is very much that its provisions will be translated into national law by the states that adhere to it, so that it will be very practical. We intend to give rights to people. To give you an example, the right to be informed that you're dealing with an AI system. So if governments use an AI system to interact with the citizens should be informed. The right to have human oversight, and not just any human oversight, but competent human oversight, and also the right to have a remedy. And also, I mentioned it before already, I used the word effective remedy. And I give you a practical example. In the Dutch case I mentioned, it turned out that the Dutch judiciary was not prepared and not trained to assess questions relating to the use of an AI system, and refrained from going into the merits of the case. Basically, probably with the, not even probably, basically with the idea that the computer said it was okay. So who were they to challenge this, right? So a very practical example of what I hope our treaty will lead to is that under national legislations, judges will be trained to sit on a bench that is competent to hear cases with regard to digital developments such as AI. And since, although our metaverse interested participants are not there, also with other new developments such as the metaverse, where legal issues may arise. And that would, for instance, mean that just as we now have a juvenile chamber in a court or a criminal chamber in a court, that you would have a tech chamber in a court, where citizens would find judges who are aware of the issues that arise with regard to the use of technology, such as artificial intelligence, and are able to really provide a remedy, a meaningful remedy to citizens. These are just some examples, but I wanted to illustrate a bit what we're doing.
I think that's a really fascinating point around the competence of the legal system to be able to determine outcomes and so on. We talked earlier a little bit about the fact that even a very large company like BT actually sits in a very kind of complex ecosystem of suppliers and customers and so on. When it has to think about that ecosystem. And Johnny, I was wondering if you have any examples of where you're seeing more of a kind of ecosystem type approach to some of these issues. Where rather than just individual companies trying to do the right thing, where you're seeing that kind of collaboration.
Sure. Well, I'll give an example even from my own work. In part, some of the work of how it's been developed has been because actually something that Jan mentioned earlier was that I had members from the public sector saying to me they had private companies coming to them wanting to sell a tool. Like, this is going to help you to do X. And with the police forces across the UK, there's different procurement processes, et cetera. They're all being sold different tools and not necessarily using the same tools. But also they didn't know if these tools were actually fit for purpose. They were often developed in the US and then marketed to the UK. And so, of course, there's pieces around training data, et cetera. But even when they developed some of these tools based on UK data, it still wasn't clear that it was fit for purpose. And so some of that has then now led to some of the work that we've been doing, which is actually working with some of these companies, but also starting from the beginning. What is it that particular sector needs for addressing that issue? And bringing in, when we were saying the stakeholder engagement side, building in that stakeholder engagement from the beginning. And what we still find challenging again, though, is the meaningful stakeholder engagement and participatory approach, not just from public, private, nonprofit sector of those immediately involved, but the marginalized groups that might be most impacted by this in a way that isn't tokenistic, that doesn't become exploitative again. And so these are where we are seeing a whole field within AI, sort of research and innovation, which around participatory AI. But again, we're still faced with how do we do this well? And I think that there's great efforts in that. We don't necessarily, it hasn't translated across the entire ecosystem, but I think there is momentum building to do this.
You're sort of seeing some examples, but not a sort of universal approach.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm keen to try and include if there are any questions. Yes, there's a question here and then a question here. So I'll take the lady over there first.
Thanks. I just had a very similar question around the public sector are being approached by so many different startups, by different companies with different products, and without that sort of validation, I suppose. But I think there's also another challenge, which is like the digital literacy that we were talking about earlier as well, that actually do they know how to ask the right questions? And I suppose there's that education piece as well, so that especially in the public sector where there is sort of a bit of a digital immaturity in comparison to private sector. So I suppose, what do you think the best way of doing that is? Is it like having a specialist or that can ask those questions, or do you think it's actually just raising the literacy for everyone?
Is that
Yeah.
to me? So I would say it's probably both. There is something to raising the literacy for everyone in some degree, but it doesn't take away from the fact of needing people within those teams that actually have sort of the strong skill sets to this. I mean, we heard Jan also speaking about judges in courts getting some of this training, and I've already seen the issue of, I came from working on tools that went to courts where they're based on forensic evidence, and we saw this issue of these tools, some of them commercial products, some of them academic products, so they're open source, and the challenge of courts, both the scientists didn't actually know how to explain it because it was actually developed by statisticians and engineers, and how do they explain the underlying models? And so even if you want to say the end user didn't know how to explain the model in itself. So yes, they need to get better understanding, not just become a user of it. And the courts also need to get a better understanding of it. But you do need those people working together. And I think this comes back to kind of actually, what is the co-design element of it to the upping the literacy for actually everyone in the public in itself.
Yeah, your question really spoke to me as well. Being involved in the online safety regime, there's a huge potential for mitigations or recommendations, or indeed elements of the codes of practice that Ofcom will be developing, which will act as a safe harbor for companies to comply with their duties under the Online Safety Bill. There's a big possibility for these kinds of regulatory interventions to be kingmakers, or to make and break nascent industries. And I think if we were going into this with blinders on and simply trying to maximize for our own policy objectives as laid out in this one piece of legislation, there's a high risk for unintended consequences there that could have knock-on effects, not just on fundamental rights, but also on the way that markets are shaped, or any other unknown consequences down the line. So for that reason, I think it's really important to not only upskill and have people asking the right questions and documenting their evidence base, but we've also, 2 years ago, we launched this Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. It's the DRCF. It involves Ofcom, also the Competition and Markets Authority, the ICO, and the Financial Conduct Authority. And that we've got several work streams. One of them, for example, online safety and data protection, or online safety and safety tech, quote unquote, markets. What does this look like? And how do the regulatory interventions that Ofcom is considering under the Online Safety Bill bear out? How would they create additional burdens on our colleagues from the ICO, for example, who will end up having the regulatory relationship with the safety tech sector that we do not, because they're not user-to-user video sharing or search services? And I think that kind of joined-up approach is absolutely essential as we enter this new phase of regulation.
We are huge fans of the DRCF here at TechUK, but the crucial thing about it is it's specialists in different areas coming together to gain that wider picture. And it's not just a merging of all the specializations into one sort of super regulator. It's a real kind of platform for dialogue, which I think is, that draws on the specializations of the individual.
Oh yeah, we've each got our own remits and our own legislation that we're following.
We think it's an excellent model. We've just got time for one last question here, and then I think we're going to have to go to the coffee break, unfortunately. But
are you sure we have time? Because I don't.
We'll just slot it in, please. Go ahead.
Okay. So I just wanted to air just slightly the relationship between ethics and rights, with the title of this summit being Digital Ethics Summit. And here we are talking about rights, and what we hear from Jan, particularly in the Council of Europe, is a vision of rights and a rights convention that would essentially cover very similar ground to what we've been talking about today in the ethics side. We heard a critique this morning, I think. Well, when I first started looking at this topic about a year ago, rights weren't really in the conversation in the UK. It was all about ethics, AI ethics. Now I think they are in the conversation, but the critique we heard this morning was, a focus on individual rights is too narrow because it excludes group harms and collective interests, and also societal risks and democratic values and so on. So I'd just be interested to hear the panel's take, or some of the panel's take, on the relationship between discussions in terms of rights and discussions in terms of ethics here, and particularly on that critique.
A really great question, but we'll have to ask you to be fairly brief, but I would like to go to all of you, because I do think it's the question that goes to the heart of what we're talking about here. Who would like to kick us off?
I can kick us off.
Okay.
I think that critique might be a rather myopic understanding of human rights, because as I alluded to earlier, there are economic, social, and cultural rights which more pertain to the groups, rights of groups or communities. Increasingly, there's really interesting work being done around environmental rights, for example, or even the rights of inanimate objects. There's considerations about, do rivers or things have rights? That's a bit fringe, to be honest. But I think that saying that the focus on individual rights or on human rights is A, limited to individuals, or B, in any way constricting, is just a misunderstanding. And I think that is quite significant, because it closes the door to all of the many methodologies around human rights impact assessments, or the canon of scholarship that has been produced since the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was first ratified more than a half a century ago. So I'm really glad to see that these things are coming together and that we can benefit from the scholarship coming from both fields.
Anjali?
Just echoing, I think, Colin there is, I think it is probably a narrow kind of understanding if we just say it's just individual rights and doesn't take into account the collective or group rights. I think also in terms of the impacts, the social and economic and environmental impacts are also becoming clearer in other ways of the fact that actually machine learning algorithms are consuming more and more data, which is not only a social, cultural, human rights, data rights issue, it's actually an environmental issue. And that has impacts which has often disparate impacts across society as well. And those are intrinsically linked to rights, not just on the fringe side, but on the direct.
Jan,
this must be your specialist subject in terms of.
Yes, you give me half an hour, I take it. No, I'll be very brief, and I can fully agree with what was said just before. I also agree that individual human rights and group rights are not at all mutually exclusive, quite on the contrary. And for the convention we're working on, in addition to the individual rights, there is at the moment a draft provision, which I very much hope will stay, on the environmental impact. Since that was mentioned, environmental impact, very important. A gender equality requirement to be taken into account is also included, and vulnerable groups are also specifically mentioned. So I think the idea that groups and individuals, or that individual rights wouldn't cover particular groups, I think is not right. And as I said in our text, we're very much focusing on some of these specific impacts. By the way, with the environment, I think we're all in the same group. I think everyone is in the same group there. Yeah. Then the last point I really would like to make is that, and I started at the beginning, ethics are very important. And it's very good that companies have ethical charters, that governments abide by ethical standards. But you cannot invoke an ethical charter before a court. And in the Dutch case, for instance, ethical guidelines would not probably would not have prevented, perhaps, but certainly wouldn't have provided a remedy. So whereas ethics are a very good basis, I think we need to go further and translate these ethics, at least on a number of issues, perhaps not on everything, but on a number of fundamental questions where the use of these technologies really impacts human rights or has a big impact on the rule of law or democracy, that we should go beyond ethics and speak about rights.
Thank you. And Titana?
Just to be in agreement with everyone on the panel, I think that ethical frameworks and human rights frameworks are complementary, and we can use them together. And I don't think we need to think of them as separate, or just echoing the conversation about kind of communal rights, or thinking about societal impacts. I think that they're definitely complementary, and we should be using both.
Thank you very much. And just to finish, I think if any of you were experiencing FOMO of sitting here thinking what's going on in the metaverse, I'm pretty convinced that many of the issues that they were talking about in the other room were actually about human rights and how we protect human rights in the metaverse. Thank you very much for all bearing with us. Thank you so much to the panel. Thank you, Jan, for joining us.